Dr. Anne Webster, member for Mallee, good to have you back with us on Flow.
Thank you, Rikki. Great to be with you.
Now, we have some positive news in a sense. The lockdowns are ending across the states. In your electorate, the impact is still being felt, but it's easing off a little bit.
Look, it is. And, happy Freedom Day for all people in Victoria who have suffered so badly under all of these restrictions and lockdowns. Unfortunately, of course, we're still faced with some confusion. I've had many people contact me quite distressed, not knowing, as hospitality venues, for example, whether they can have 10 or inside, 30 outside, or whether they have to monitor for vaccination, or it's just whether their workers have to have vaccination by today, which was what the Premier apparently did announce this week, that people had to have double vax, and then that was walked back on, and now we are, as far as I am aware, and this is the problem, even trawling through the legislation this morning, it's still not absolutely clear that the double vaccination needs to have occurred by November 26th, is how I read it. And in the interim, then there are still caps on numbers inside and outside. But honestly, I would just hope that the Victorian government's communication can be clearer for everyone's sake.
And it does appear a lot of this is focused on what's good for or what's needed in metropolitan Melbourne. I think your Victorian State Nationals leader has called for a Freedom Day of sorts for regional Victoria once it passes vaccination thresholds. Is that really where we need to go? Is we need basically all the restrictions off once you pass 80% double dose?
Well, look, I think it's a very good question. The reality is that at some point in time, we want to be living our lives without masks. For those who are vaccinated, double vaccinated, or even have a booster or third dose if they're immunocompromised, then theoretically we're pretty covered. And for those who have chosen not to get vaccinated for whatever reason, then the consequences of that will be borne out in time. Are we just hoping that there will be no consequences? Because people have choices to make, and sadly some have lost their job over this. And I think that, the freedoms, yes, we need to be mindful that the virus is still spreading around, but in a sense, it has to be spreading around so that we can develop herd immunity amongst our children who aren't vaccinated, because they're not going to have the evidence shows that children are not severely impacted. And we've got to be able to move on as a nation. So it's vaccinated or very young, perhaps not. And moving forward, the last time I looked, our over 70s were 95% or something close to that double vaccinated. So, at some point in time, decisions need to be made to let our nation get back to life.
And I noticed over in Federal Parliament you made some comments in an evening speech about the healthcare, the aged care sector, I think it was, in your electorate. They've got a shortage of staff because they've had to let people go that weren't vaccinated. You got a question at what point those people can come back to work?
Well, that's exactly right. I believe that the Premier, I know that there are plenty of people who have actually taken either long service leave or their annual leave, hoping that the mandate will be lifted. My reading of the situation in what the Premier has stated is he's intending on it, the mandate's staying in place for a longer term period, and that's into 2022. I don't know when. I'm not sure that he's actually stated it. Even when the state of emergency powers are lifted, and we all can't wait for that, because it's in legislation, that's my understanding, that the mandate will be staying.
Yeah, well, I think in some respects they're using these powers to make up the orders and sort of get the law to follow behind it, from what we could tell from the shenanigans that happened yesterday. But when we look at the agricultural workers side of things, the federal government's ag visa, there's possibly a new pathway for workers. What's happening on that front?
Yeah, look, we have the bilateral talks. Any country that is going to have an agreement with Australia, obviously it starts with a conversation. It starts with the give and take of how is this going to work, what is in it for the country, what is in it for Australia. Obviously we need agricultural workers. The ASEAN component of the ag visa is making sure that those bilateral talks have begun. My understanding is that 4 countries have entered into those talks, and the latest is Indonesia, which is fantastic news. And what we need, of course, is quarantine measures that allow workers to come in. And we've seen in New South Wales that Australians who are coming back don't need to quarantine anymore if they're double vaxxed. I mean, that provides so much hope for everyone, I think, that we can just get on it and meet the needs of our workforce, which is huge right now.
Yeah, I hear that they need thousands, even in the horticulture industry, and the peak farming bodies on the East Coast are getting together for this Eastern Agricultural Labour Task Force, saying that they're hoping to bring these people in by next month, which is only 9 days away. And they're saying the Pacific Islanders, for instance, they've largely come from nations that are heavily vaccinated and don't have COVID-19. Why is it proving so hard to get these workers in then?
Well, I think that the COVID has clearly created many barriers, and there has been, as we know, a reluctance to use some quarantine facilities for workers when we have so many Australians who are still waiting to come home. My expectation is that as these quarantine rules change, starting in New South Wales, and Aussies aren't required to quarantine, that's great news. And I believe that's is that November the 1st or December? I'd have to check the details.
Yeah, I thought it was November 1st, yeah.
Yeah. So that's fantastic news. That's only literally a week and a day away.
Yep, well, that's something to look forward to, and hopefully we're not lamenting a harvest and opportunities missed, but we're celebrating that we got the workers in just when we needed them to get the crop off and build on this bump winter crop that we're hearing about from analysts like Rabobank.
Look, absolutely. And the other task force that is stepping up as of today, it's been announced, is with one of my colleagues, Senator Perrin Davey, and the Assistant Minister for Housing, Michael Sukkar, who are putting together a task force to look into regional banking closures. I think that will be very welcome news, certainly across my electorate where we've had so many banks close, and it really has created such disconnect and, an inability for people to manage things like home loans or otherwise. Online is fantastic. We know that. We're all getting used to the digital age, but in fact, if we can't engage in it, we're incredibly limited. But, we have a lot of older folk who are not so digitally savvy, and the ability to walk into a bank and talk with someone who knows what your business is it has been a phenomenal service, and our big bank is now a part of the task force as well, so I think that's great news.
Well, I guess it's a bit like the argument with telecommunications and black spots, is that there's something of an essential service there provided by banks. You've got a minimum service obligation for some customers. Yeah,
absolutely. And, you could easily argue that customers have not had their needs met with the closures, and often really short time frames where, small rural towns have lost their banking service. And, it's fundamentally the big banks have said, well, too bad, so sad. This works for us. It certainly does not work for people on the ground.
And is that where Australia Post could step into the breach in some cases? If the bank's closed and it's not going to reopen, I guess there's a heavier burden landing on them now.
Yeah, well, that has been the general trend from what I understand, and Australia Post are part of this task force as well. So my hope is that the task force, which sounds like it's got a nice pointy end to it, will serve our regional communities well with some really good and constructive suggestions, recommendations.
Absolutely. Well, we'll look forward to how that turns out as well. Dr. Anne Webster, thanks for chatting with us today, and we'll catch you again soon.
Pleasure. Thanks, Rikki.